Hey everybody, welcome back. We're going to talk about the three basic events that occur in the life of a lymphocyte. So the first is the formation and maturation of your lymphocytes. This is going to either occur so it always occurs in the red bone marrow, but then the maturation occurs either in the red bone marrow if you're a B lymphocyte or in the thymus if you're a T lymphocyte. Once you are mature, that means you're able to recognize a specific foreign antigen and become activated. So activation of lymphocytes occurs typically when they're in their secondary lymphatic tissue, like in the lymph nodes or in tonsils or in the spleen or in the malt, and they get exposed to that first antigen. That first exposure activates them, and that's going to cause them to replicate and differentiate into the fighter cells or the memory cells. And then the last step, hold on. There we go. The last step is the effector response. So what do they do? When T lymphocytes get activated, they then are going to either start producing chemicals, so bind to the infected cells and produce chemicals that kill those cells. That's what T lymphocytes do. Or they bind to the pathogen directly and they synthesize large quantities, millions upon millions of antibodies, um, and kill the pathogen in that way. So here is the three basic stages, and here's a little, I think this is adorable. Here you have the bone marrow birth center where all lymphocytes are born. Then here we have Thymus University where T lymphocytes maturate. Once they finish this, then they're going to go off to their proper lymphatic site where they can just sit and wait for the exposure that they need to become activated. So during that first stage, they're going to train. And so maturation of T lymphocytes occurs in the thymus. And that maturation process allows T lymphocytes to learn the difference between self and non-self and become immunocompetent. Once this happens, once they have become immunocompetent, they then can go out to that secondary lymphatic tissue where they then can become activated when they are needed. And so how do lymphocytes become mature? They have to go through a positive selection test and a negative selection test. So here we see a thymus or a thymocyte. Okay, so this is just a typical T cell. Okay, this T cell has both CD4 and CD8. It's going to bind to a cell within the epithelium of the thymus itself. Okay, if the cell binds to that thymic epithelial cell, then it can survive. That's positive selection. Only the thymocytes that actually bind to the thymic epithelial cells are going to survive. Any that don't bind are going to be eliminated. So at this point, they have both CD4 and CD8 receptors. They have not differentiated into the helper T cells or the cytotoxic T cells. So then they have to go through a negative selection. In negative selection, only the cells that don't bind are going to survive. And so here we see more cells that have self proteins associated with them. Some are going to be MHC class 2 and some are going to be MHC class 1 molecules. You want the thymocytes to move along and not bind to the self cells. They can't bind in the negative selection. If they bind, that means that they will attack our own self cells. And so not binding allows the cells to survive. And that's negative selection. So only the cells that don't bind will survive. After that, they're then going to either maturate into a helper T cell or a cytotoxic T cell, depending on what they decide to be when they grow up. And this is, these cells are now considered self-tolerant. They express both, but so they initially expressed both of the proteins, but they're going to remove either the CD4 or the CD8. It just depends on what they want to become. And so over here we have CD4 thymocytes, over here we have CD8 thymocytes. So these are cytotoxic Ts and these are helper Ts. And then they're released from the thymus and they move to the secondary lymphatic tissue where they can then respond to an actual pathogen. So leaving the thymus, the cell is considered immunocompetent, but it is still never been activated. So it's considered a naive cell, immunocompetent lymphocyte. And once it goes to the secondary lymphatic structure that it's going to live in, it'll then test all of the materials moving through the lymphatic system. And if it can bind, that means that now it has found its pathogen and it's going to become activated. So during the activation step, or during the activation, that's the first time the pathogen ever comes in contact with the lymphocyte, that's called the first encounter or the antigenic challenge. And at this point, the T cell or B cell is going to, once it gets co-activated by the helper Ts, then it's going to start proliferating, producing lots of copies of itself or clones, and it's going to produce some memory cells. So these clones are going to be identical to the original T cell, and then the memory cells are going to be there just to remember that pathogen. And so here we have a naive T cell. It binds to an MHC class 1 self non-self protein on the surface of a body cell. Once it binds, it's not going to let go. It's going to get co-activated by the release of interleukins that will stimulate or co-stimulate the helper or the cytotoxic T cell. And that stimulates the cytotoxic T cell to start producing clones of itself. So those clones are going to be identical to it, and they're all going to become cytotoxic T cells that will kill any body cells that have that same pathogen. It will also produce less, but still it'll produce some memory cells. These memory cells will just sit and wait in that lymphatic tissue. They don't go out to fight. They wait for another antigenic challenge later on. So the first stimulation is the contact between the T cell and the pathogen, or I'm sorry, the T cell and the self cell with the MHC complex. And so here we're looking at helper T cells. Helper T cells bind to antigen presenting cells that have their MHC class 2 molecules on the surface. Once they bind, that binding is the first stimulation. Then the T cell is going to release chemicals. These interleukins are going to co-stimulate the helper T cells. And this co-stimulation is going to produce clone or allow the helper T's to produce clones of themselves. So now they have more helper T cells and memory helper T cells that will remember the foreign invader. Whereas cytotoxic T cells bind to the surface of a self cell with MHC class 1 that also has the pathogen associated with it. The cytotoxic T cell then gets co-stimulated by the release of interleukin 2 from the helper T lymphocyte, which then activates the cytotoxic T cell, and it will start proliferating and differentiating into clones of the cytotoxic T cell and memory cytotoxic T cells. All right, so I clicked on the link for the cell-mediated immunity, and now I'm just seeing if it'll work. I feel like it's not going to work. If you click on this link, it should take you right to a website where we can see I'm going to try something quickly because sometimes it works on other websites better. Aha. So I know that Firefox seems to work really well for this.
Cell-mediated immunity is the form of immunity carried out.
I'm sorry. So you're going to watch this on your own. There are multiple parts to it. You just play it and it'll go through and it'll help you understand T cell immunity, okay? And then I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. Yes. Okay. And then I'll quickly go over B cell immunity, but hold on a second. I'm going to see how much longer we have on this PowerPoint. So I'm going to stop this video here because it's been 12 minutes and we still have about 20 slides left. And hopefully we'll have one more lecture, or if not, we'll have 2 lectures and we'll go into B cell immunity. Okay. Bye.